Welcome. Today we're looking at one of the most incredible queen sacrifices that you'll see in a game. A really wonderful game, and when better to do a queen sacrifice than when you're playing against the world champion? And that's exactly what happened in 1966 when Larsen was playing Tigran Petrosian. And we see this, it is often called Larsen's immortal game, and we'll see why. Truly wonderful. Larsen, we know, famous for playing 1b3, but also famous for playing pretty much any opening. He loved variety, and e4. He begins with, we get c5 by Petrosian, Sicilian, we get knight f3, knight c6, d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4, g6, bishop e3, bishop g7, c4, knight f6, knight c3, and we have knight g4. And here is the Maroczy bind variation, but this G4 move is not, I don't really play the Sicilian or against the Sicilian too much, at least not this way, so this was an interesting move to find out. You play queen G4 and then you play, black plays knight takes D4, and of course threatening the fork, so you drop back the queen to D1. And then we see that Petrosian drops back knight to e6. We get queen to d2 because of course you want to protect the knight against here and doubling the pawns, which is a possibility. Or you could play rook here. Not always will be played, but certainly you want to avoid that if you can. Then we get d6 and we get bishop e2. Then we get bishop d7, castles by Larsen's castles by Petrosian. We get rook to d1, which is not the most common of moves, and then we get bishop to c6, attacking this pawn and on the diagonal towards the king, maybe for later in the game. And here we get knight to d5 by Larsen, which is classified as a mistake. The computer much prefers the idea of going pushing up with the pawns and starting a queen storm, a pawn storm on the queen side. But instead we get knight to d5. Then we get rook to e8 followed by f4. And of course, after knight to d5, this gives the opportunity to go knight to c5 by Petrosian, and that would be attacking here on this pawn and attacking, so that means you would have to go and protect it, so f3, or the computer even prefers bishop f3. But if you go f3, we get a line that ends up with knight to a4, attacking the pawn, b3, then bishop takes, pawn takes, knight c3, attacking the rook and the bishop, and then we take the bishop with the knight. And after rook to e8, the game is balanced, but we got same colored bishops, even amount of pawns, and yeah, interesting game to go from here. But going back to the position, we see after knight to d5, we get rook to e8. And then we get f4, and of course all of this is just setting the scene for the dramatics that will happen later in the game. So we have f4 followed by knight to c5, and here we get f5 by Larsen, which is interesting because if you could get this knight to this square, well then look at all of the squares it would control. It would be in a beautiful spot. So Petrosian decides, well, how can I get the knight here to e5? So he decides to start on this motion by going knight to a6. So from knight to a6, the idea is to go to c5, and then from c5 to go to d7, which will then get you to your promised square. Here Larsen plays bishop to g4, then we get knight c5, we get f takes g6, Now, of course, you're attacking this pawn, which would have the threat of attacking the queen, but you can't take that, because if you did, for instance, well, then you would play pawn to f7 check, king would have to move here, then you would lose the rook with a check, and after the queen takes back, you've lost the whole rook with no advantage. So instead, in the game, after knight c5 and f takes g5, we take back with the h pawn, and then we get queen to f2 by Larsen. So Larsen here lining up a double attack, first of all on the pawn on f7, but also here on the knight with the bishop, which would be ultimately gathering up this pawn here. And not only is it gathering up this pawn, because then you would have an x-ray on the queen. So we get rook to f8 in the game, followed by e5. Now e5, again thinking of chipping away here and trying to open up this x-ray on this diagonal. So we get bishop to e5. Now bishop to e5 draws the bishop away from its cubbyhole. So we get queen to h4. We get bishop takes knight, and then rook takes, with the idea of rook takes, that if black just played something like a6, well, then the rook could now play rook takes bishop on e5, and if you take with the pawn, well, then you win the knight with the bishop getting 2 pieces for your rook. So we see Larsen has many different tactical ideas here in the game. So after rook takes, Petrosian decides to get away from this idea by playing knight to e6. So knight to e6. Another way that you could have maybe got out of this was just by playing e6 straight away. And in this position, white would just trade off the queens, take the bishop with the rook, then capture the knight with the bishop, and you've got a very interesting game here where you've got 2 rooks versus a rook and 2 bishops, even amount of pawns. You could try and protect and go something like this in the game. And of course, in this position, you could not take the pawn here because you would now be walking into a nasty checkmate. So just showing that there's a lot going on in this position, a lot of calculation needed. In the game, of course, Petrosian decided to play knight to e6. After knight to e6, we get the very simple rook to f3 with the idea of getting to the h3 position and going for checkmate along the h file. So we get f6 followed by h6 by Larsen. Then Petrosian goes to bishop to g7, and here we see one of the greatest queen sacrifices that you will ever see in a game, especially when you're playing against a world champion. What a move that Larsen plays here. He plays queen to g check, g6, brilliant move. And well, what can you do here? Let's say you take with the f-pawn. Well, if you take with the f-pawn, very simply you get check with the bishop, followed by king to h7, followed by rook to h3 check. Only thing you can do is block off with the bishop. So then after taking bishop on h6 and rook to f5, the idea is if you play here, it's checkmate, basically. So giving yourself an opportunity to take here, which means after playing rook to f5 and pawn takes, now if you move this bishop up here, you're after moving given a square escape square, so you would play bishop to f7. Then after queen to b6, king to h1, you now have to give up your queen to stay in the game. So pretty difficult. So after in this position, let's say you went something like knight to c7 to get rid of this idea. You could go queen to g7. This is a beautiful checkmate. King to g7, rook to g5 check, king to h6, and then boom, ladder checkmate. So wonderful. A lot going on in this position, and in the game, Petrosian, realizing what a desperate position he's in, plays the rather nice move, knight to f4. Now, knight to f4 is, of course, forking the rook with the queen. So how does Larsen respond? Well, he plays Another brilliant move. He plays rook to f4, leaving his queen hang, taking the knight. And in the game, Petrosian plays f to g6. You get bishop to e6 check, and then having to block, Petrosian felt, with rook to f7, because we're going to find ourselves in the same kind of formation here. Otherwise, as we just looked at, as if we went to king to h7, you get rook to h4 check, followed by blocking with the bishop, and again we find ourselves in a similar scenario. Now, king h7 is the best move according to the computer, but after rook blocks on f7, you get rook takes on f7, king to h8, rook to g5, attacking this pawn now. So we get b5 by Petrosian. There's not a whole lot you can do here, and you get rook to g3 with the simple idea of checking and going for the checkmate, as we've seen previously. So as you see, a really wonderful game by Larsen against the world champion.